A millionaire unexpectedly returns home and finds his two little girls shivering so violently their lips were turning blue. But the chilling developments didn't stop there. Take a deep breath and settle in for this tale. My hope is that this story will be the perfect catalyst to help you drift off to sleep tonight. Ready? Let's dive in. Seattle was drowning in rain, a thick, persistent drizzle. It had been falling since the night before, saturating the cold, wet steps leading up to the Walker family's luxurious mansion. The hazy light of the early morning barely pierced the gray mist reflecting dully off the still surface of Lake Union. The sprawling 8,500-square-foot home stood silently, seemingly swallowing every sound of the city. Ethan Walker stood by the living room window. The faint light from the overhead fixture illuminated his face, making his pale complexion look even more weary. In his hand, a mug of coffee had gone cold, and the damp air still carried the scent of wet flooring. For 3 years since Clara, his late wife, passed away suddenly from a heart incident, he hadn't known a truly peaceful morning. There was only the sound of the rain and the lingering emptiness in his heart. From the staircase, soft footsteps echoed. Veronica appeared, her brown hair neatly tied back, a cream silk robe perfectly cinched at the waist. "Up early again, darling?" she asked, her voice gentle. Ethan didn't turn around, just nodded slightly. "The sound of the rain keeps me awake." Veronica slowly walked closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You need to learn to let your mind rest. I'll take care of everything." Ethan quietly replied, "I know." From the room next door, a weak cry could be heard, either Lila or Sophie. Veronica quickly turned and left, her steps light yet determined. Ethan watched her go, his gaze a mixture of gratitude and alienation. She had come into his life when he was nearly broken, when everything seemed to be falling apart. She said she only wanted to help him heal, to ensure the two little ones had a warm home again. And he had believed her. Upstairs, the nursery was filled with soft white light. The twin girls lay in their cribs, their faces identical in every feature except for a small beauty mark on Sophie's left cheek. Veronica bent down, lifting each child out of the crib. There, sweeties. Mommy's here." She kissed the child's forehead, her lips touching lightly, but her eyes looked vacant. When Lila let out a soft sniffle, Veronica briefly tightened her grip, then immediately relaxed. "It's okay. Everything's going to be fine." Her voice was even light, but lacking any real warmth. The door opened, and Ruth, the elderly housekeeper, entered with blankets and bottles. "I've prepared the milk for the babies." Veronica looked up, a ready-made smile appearing. "Thank you, Ruth, but let me do it. I prefer to care for them myself." Ruth stood still for a few seconds, then nodded, placing the bottles down. "The water just finished heating up. You should let it cool a bit." "I know," Veronica answered without looking back. As Ruth turned to leave, she heard Veronica whisper so softly it almost blended with the rain. "Soon they will only need me." Ruth paused at the doorway, her expression briefly shifting. She turned back and caught Veronica smiling. "Could you fix me some tea?" Her voice was so sweet, so gentle, it was difficult to detect the hidden layer beneath. Ruth nodded, leaving the room, but her gaze lingered silently on Veronica's hands, her fingers gripping the baby bottles so tightly they were turning white. Downstairs, Ethan opened his laptop, preparing for a video conference. His life was now all about numbers, charts, and contracts, a way to avoid thinking about what he had lost. Veronica came down, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I think you should come home early tonight. The babies need you. And I need you too." Ethan sighed softly. "All right. If work wraps up early." "Not if, Ethan. Let yourself live a little," she said, then left her light perfume lingering in the air. Ruth walked past, her eyes briefly meeting Ethan's, as if she wanted to say something, but then decided against it. She went straight to the kitchen. She had watched Ethan grow up, knew him as a kind and stubborn child. Now, the young master was living in a cold house with a woman she simply couldn't trust. In the kitchen, Ruth quietly wiped down the used baby bottle. Outside the window, the rain intensified, the wind buffeting the trees along the driveway. At noon, when Ethan left for the office, Veronica stood by the stairs to see him off. "I'll tidy up and give the girls their bath, don't worry." I trust you." Ethan smiled, then walked away. The moment the door closed, Veronica's smile vanished. She went straight upstairs, her heels clicking steadily on the wooden floor. Ruth emerged from the laundry room, saw her, and called out, "Miss Hayes, do you need any help?" "No need. I prefer to care for them myself." The answer came from the staircase light, but final. Inside the bathroom, steam clouded the air. Veronica turned on the tap, tested the temperature with her hand, then poured the water into a metallic basin set in the middle of the room. The two babies sat in their cribs, watching their stepmother with curious eyes. Veronica turned back, took off her outer robe, and smiled. "Come on, today we're going to be clean and adorable, just like two little angels." She bent down, picked up Lila, and placed her in the basin. The baby shivered slightly, her small hand grasping the edge of the basin, eyes wide with fear. Veronica placed a hand on her back, her voice soft as a breath. "Quiet now, Mommy's here." But in the instant, a flash of light from a lightning strike outside the window hit her face. Her expression shifted. Her eyes were empty, so cold the entire room seemed to freeze. Ruth stood in the hallway listening to the running water. A sudden premonition made her open the door and step in. Before her, Veronica was pouring water over the two children's heads, the motion slow, but not gentle. "What are you doing?" Ruth exclaimed, rushing forward. Veronica turned, her smile intact. "Giving them a bath, can't you see? The water is freezing, don't you realize? You speak as if I don't know how to mother." Veronica put the pitcher down, her gaze like a sharpened edge. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Ruth stepped forward, snatching the pitcher from her hand. Clara used to say that too. And she stopped, her eyes full of sorrow. Veronica stood straight, a thin smile forming. "Don't bring her up in this house again. I am the one in this family now." The air was thick. The two children began to cry. Ruth bent down to lift them, but Veronica held her back. "Give them to me." "No." Ruth shook her head, holding the children tightly, stepping back toward the door. "Do you think you have the right to do that?" Veronica asked, her voice low, her gaze seemingly drifting through an invisible shadow. A clap of thunder boomed. The blue light of the lightning flash streamed through the window pane, shining directly onto Veronica's face. In that moment, Ruth saw the truth behind the smile, something cold, hard, and sharp as steel. Veronica didn't say another word. She just stood still, her hand still resting on the edge of the water basin, her eyes fixed on the crying children clutched in Ruth's arms. The Seattle afternoon brightened after the long rain. The clouds were still thick, but a weak light managed to break through, reflecting off the grass still dotted with water. Ethan's SUV turned into the stone driveway, the tires grinding on the wet surface, leaving gray water trails. He turned off the engine, stepped out sighing as he untied his necktie. It was a rare occasion for him to be home early, driven by his longing for the little ones. In his mind, he pictured Clara bathing the children in the yard on sunny afternoons, the light catching her hair like honey. He lightly gripped his briefcase strap, quickening his pace. The sound of running water came from somewhere in the back of the house. Strange. The indoor water supply had been shut off yesterday due to a payment issue. He had even received a call from the water company this morning. That running water shouldn't be here. Then laughter. Two small, faint, interrupted but real voices, Lila and Sophie. Amidst those sounds was a familiar female voice, light and steady like a lullaby. Ethan felt his heart warm for a moment, but just a few steps later, all warmth vanished. He turned past the dripping rosebush and stopped dead in his tracks. Veronica was squatting beside an old metallic basin, faint steam rising gently. The two babies were naked, shaking violently in the basin, their skin flushed red, their lips starting to turn blue. Veronica poured water over their shoulders, her eyes terrifyingly calm. "What in the world?" Veronica. Ethan roared, his voice hoarse. "What are you doing?" Veronica jumped, her hand freezing mid-motion. She turned around, her face obscured by steam. "Ethan." She took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. "The indoor water was cut off, so I'm just heating water to bathe them. I didn't want them to get any dirtier." "Warm," he growled, stepping forward. His hand touching the edge of the basin, the water was scalding hot. The heat seared his skin, leaving a stinging sensation. He lifted Sophie out quickly, wrapping a towel from the chair around her, looking at Veronica as if she were a stranger. "Do you think this is okay?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising, each word punctuated sharply. "It's barely 50 degrees outside and the wind is colder than the lake water. Do you want these babies to get sick?" Veronica stood up, her hands, still shaking, her face pale. "I just wanted them clean, you don't understand." "No, I understand perfectly." Ethan took a step closer. "You wanted to prove you're a better mother than Clara, right?" Veronica opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered, revealing something both vulnerable and dangerous. "Don't bring her into this, Ethan. I would never compare myself to the deceased." "Then what is it?" he said, his voice choking up. "Is this how you heal this family, by letting my children shiver like that? I'm sorry." Veronica lowered her head, tears streaming down her face, her voice fading. "I truly just wanted to do the right thing." I saw them enjoying the bath. They were smiling. Smiling, Ethan nearly laughed bitterly. "Don't you see they are turning blue?" He held Sophie tightly in his arms, his chest heaving. "I don't need anyone to teach me how to be a father." Footsteps sounded from the kitchen door. Ruth rushed out, startled. "Mr. Ethan." "What's going on?" Ethan didn't answer. He picked up both children, wrapping them tightly in towels, his hands shaking with anger. Ruth looked around, saw the steaming basin, the heat rising in thick plumes. She cautiously touched it, then quickly withdrew her hand. "My goodness," she gasped. Veronica turned away quickly, wiping her tears. "I told you I didn't mean any harm." "I just stop it," Ethan snapped, cutting her off, the sound echoing across the empty yard. "I don't want to hear it anymore." He turned his back, carrying both children straight into the house. Ruth watched silently, her heart sinking. Outside, Veronica still stood in the same spot, her hands gripping her dress until her knuckles were white. When the back door closed, she took a deep breath, the tears vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Her face became frigid, her eyes darkening. "Right," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You'll see I'm right. In my own way." She bent down, looking at the basin. The water's surface reflected a dull sky, and her own image distorted, blurred by the heat. Veronica stood up quietly, lifting the basin and heading toward the rose bushes. Ruth watched from the kitchen window, her hand frozen in midair. Outside, Veronica knelt beside the flower bed, using a small trowel to dig a hole. Instead of pouring the water out as usual, she poured the entire contents of the basin into the hole, then buried the basin itself. Each scoop of dirt falling onto the ground sounded heavy and slow. Ruth gasped. She intended to run out, but stopped, fear swelling in her chest. She could only stand there, looking through the steamed-up glass. Outside, the clouds gathered again. The wind picked up, sweeping through the backyard, shaking the wet rose bushes. Veronica covered the basin with the last layer of dirt, lightly patting it down with her foot. Then she stood up straight, dusting off her hands, her eyes fixed on the house behind her. Ethan looked down from the upstairs window, seeing Veronica bending over in the garden. He sighed, his anger still lingering, but then Clara's voice from years ago echoed in his mind. "Never let your anger blind you." He shook his head slightly, holding the two children close under the blanket. "It's okay, Daddy's here now." Down below, Veronica looked up. The faint sunset light hit her face, a streak of brightness cutting across her eyes. A thin smile spread across her lips, devoid of any warmth. She turned around, walking slowly back into the house, locking the backyard door behind her. The Seattle morning was draped in mist. The damp, cold air seeped through the window panes, condensing into tiny droplets. In the second-floor bedroom, the two little girls slept soundly, their cheeks rosy again, after a long night, their breathing steady as the wind. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes resting on his daughter's tiny hand, tightly gripping the edge of the blanket. He let out a breath, a sigh that sounded like a heavy burden being lifted. All night long, the image of Veronica bending over the basin haunted him. Her eyes when he yelled at her, the tear rolling down her cheek, her trembling hands. Thinking back now, he felt he had been unnecessarily harsh. She just wanted to help, he told himself. He gently adjusted the blanket for the two babies and stepped out of the room. The sound of a spoon clanking against a pot echoed from the kitchen, blending with the faint smell of coffee. Ethan stopped at the doorway. Veronica stood with her back to him, her hair neatly tied, wearing a white shirt, her motions slow and steady as she wiped the table. The kitchen was softly lit, remarkably tidy. She turned around, a thin thread-like smile on her face. "You're up early, I couldn't sleep," Ethan replied, walking closer. He looked around, seeing the steaming coffee cup and a slice of toast already on the plate. "Veronica," he hesitated, taking a deep breath. "About yesterday. I overreacted. I apologize." Veronica remained silent for a few seconds, as if waiting for him to continue. Then she placed the coffee cup in front of him, her voice so light it was barely audible. "I understand. Any mother would be afraid of losing her children, even if they aren't biological." Ethan froze. That sentence felt like a needle piercing his defenses. He looked at her, unsure what else to say. In that moment, Veronica looked truly kind, truly understanding. A part of him relented. Ruth walked past in the hallway, seeing the scene from afar. Veronica's eyes briefly glanced over, paused for a second, then smiled at Ethan. The smile no longer carried hurt, but self-assurance. Ruth frowned, a chill running down her spine. Throughout the day, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Veronica was gentle, meticulous, and unbelievably sweet. She sang the two babies strange, soft, steady lullabies and read them stories in a voice as sweet as honey. Lila and Sophie smiled more often, their eyes less fearful. Ethan walked past his home office, stopping at the doorframe. He watched the scene, his heart softening. Maybe he'd been wrong after all. He stepped in, lightly placing a hand on Veronica's shoulder. "You're working so hard." "Thank you." She looked up, her smile gentle but not entirely joyful. "This is what I should do. I just want us to truly become a family." In the afternoon, she cooked a magnificent dinner: beef stew, mashed potatoes, pumpkin soup, all his favorite dishes. As Ruth brought out the trays, Veronica quietly said, "You can take the evening off. I'll handle the cleanup." Her voice was soft, but her gaze made it impossible for Ruth to refuse. After dinner, Ethan sat reading the newspaper in the living room. Veronica brought him a thick stack of papers, carefully placing them in front of him. "I have a few ideas. Could you take a look?" Ethan picked them up, his eyes quickly scanning the neat handwriting: child care plan, nutrition menu, charity fundraising project for families who have lost mothers. He looked up, his eyes viewing Veronica differently. "You think about everything so thoroughly." Veronica sat beside him, a fleeting smile appearing. "I just want us to be a perfect family." "Ethan, a place where the two little ones can grow up happy, lacking nothing." He nodded, his voice softening. "I'm grateful you always think of the children. Maybe I should trust you more." "I don't need your trust," she replied softly, something unreadable flashing in her eyes. "I just need you to see." Ruth walked past, catching the tail end of the conversation, and paused slightly. She looked toward the coffee table where the stack of papers lay open, a small line visible in the corner of a page staff list: proposal for reduction to optimize budget for housekeeper gardener security. She slowly backed away, her heart heavy. Night fell, and the Walker house sank into silence. The two babies slept soundly in their room, the warm glow of the nightlight casting shadows on the ceiling. Ethan lay in his study, his eyes closed from exhaustion. Across the hallway, Veronica sat in front of her laptop, the screen light reflecting off her cheek. She typed the final lines of an email. "Phase 1 complete. He believes it." The cursor blinked on the screen for a few seconds, then she pressed send. A faint whoosh sound echoed in the quiet room. Veronica closed the laptop, leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. Outside the window, the wind rustled through the rose bushes. Beneath the damp soil in the corner of the garden, the metallic basin lay still, silent, cold, and unknown to anyone that it was the first marker of a terrible misdeed. Upstairs, the faint cry of a child could be heard. Veronica opened her eyes, listened for a second, then stood up. A rare moment of early summer sunshine spread over the mansion. The doorbell chimed across the sun-drenched courtyard, echoing in the still air. The door of the house opened. On the threshold, a young woman stood waiting. Annie Miller, 23 years old. Her beige coat was dusty from the road, her hair slightly messy from the wind, but her eyes were bright and determined. In her hand, an old canvas bag with worn straps. Ethan came down the stairs, a steaming coffee mug in his hand. He was surprised to see a stranger in the house. "Excuse me, you are—" Veronica appeared right behind him, her movements slow, her smile soft as mist. "Ah, Annie Miller. She's taking over for Ruth. I asked her to come this morning." Ethan frowned slightly, his voice revealing a hint of surprise. "I thought Ruth was staying until the end of the week." Veronica took his hand, her voice low and gentle. "She wanted to leave early. She's been watching the babies for a month. I think she was tired. Annie used to work at a child care center and has an auxiliary nursing certificate. I think she's a good fit." Annie bowed her head, her hands clasped together. "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Walker." Her voice was soft, quiet, mixed with slight tension. Ethan nodded, polite, but still slightly wary. From the top of the stairs, Ruth slowly walked down, pulling a small suitcase. Her eyes met Annie's, pausing. They looked at each other for a few seconds, as if something unspoken passed between them. When Ruth drew closer, she quietly said, just loud enough for Annie to hear, "Be careful of her." Then she turned and left, without looking back. Veronica watched her go, a slight smirk on her lips. "She's old, not used to new ways. Don't mind her?" Annie only nodded softly. She followed Veronica into the house, her eyes discreetly scanning the space, the vast mansion, the gleaming wooden floors, everything so clean it felt sterile. The next morning, the sky was clear and bright, a rare Seattle sight. Annie began her first duties, laundry, cooking breakfast, tidying the nursery. She did everything meticulously, not saying much, but always smiling when she looked at the two babies. Lila and Sophie seemed to like her instantly. Whenever she sang softly, the two would giggle, their laughter filling the room. Ethan walked past, paused at the door, and smiled faintly. "You seem great with the little ones," Annie quietly replied. "I just think they need more talking to Mr. Walker. At this age, children understand more than we realize." Ethan nodded, his gaze momentarily softening. From the kitchen below, Veronica looked up, watching the scene through the doorway crack. Her hand gripping the coffee mug froze. When Lila burst into a louder giggle, she squeezed her hand hard, a faint crack sound audible. She quickly walked in, a practiced smile plastered on her face. "Annie, you don't need to hold them that long. Children can get spoiled if they're carried all day." Annie politely bowed her head. "Yes, ma'am." But before putting the child down in the crib, she gently kissed her forehead. That gesture made Veronica subtly eye her, the smile vanishing for a fleeting moment. In the following days, the house became eerily quiet. Annie worked like a shadow, mopping floors, doing laundry, watching the babies. But every time she intended to get closer to the children, Veronica was there, standing on the stairs or sitting in the corner of the kitchen, her eyes observing like a silent warden. Annie noticed Veronica never let anyone else prepare the baby's food. Every morning she mixed the milk herself, allowing no help, not even from Annie. Once Annie lightly asked, "May I help you with the morning milk? I just want to learn how you care for them." Veronica looked at her, the smile not reaching her eyes. "No need. I'm used to it. You just need to clean the rooms." Ethan was constantly busy, usually leaving early in the morning and returning late at night. He handed over all household matters, schedules, and even bills to Veronica. "I trust you can handle it," he said. And she only replied, "I always give it my best." One late afternoon, the setting sun hit the wall of the home office. Annie walked past, intending to bring up the laundry, when she saw Veronica bending over the safe. She stopped short. Veronica opened the safe, took out a thick envelope, checked it quickly, and closed the safe. When she turned around, seeing Annie, she paused for a few seconds. "Is your shift over?" "Yes. I was just bringing the laundry up." Veronica smiled, placing the envelope on the desk. "Payroll money. You know how to keep a secret, don't you, Annie?" Their eyes met. A long, heavy second passed. Annie nodded lightly. "I won't say anything, ma'am. That's a good girl." Veronica replied. Her voice even then walked away. That night, Annie sat by the small window in the servants' quarters, the desk lamp illuminating her worn diary page. She wrote, "Everything in this house is too quiet, too clean, but unnatural. It's like someone is trying too hard to make it look normal." She looked up. A soft lullaby echoed from the nursery, her own voice recorded on a device Veronica had installed to help the babies get used to her voice. Annie shivered. Upstairs, Veronica stood by her bedroom window, wine swirling in her glass. The red light of the sunset hit the wall, casting a warm hue on her face. But when Annie's recorded voice sang out, Veronica's eyes slowly darkened. She put the wine glass down, her voice low, just loud enough for herself to hear. "If you think you can steal his attention." A heavy breath, then the complete whisper. "You will regret it." Veronica picked up her phone, opening a secret messaging app. Her finger quickly typed, "The new hire is getting too familiar. Need to change plans." She pressed send, then turned off the screen. The light in the room followed suit. Only the dim red light from a burning cigarette end remained reflecting off her cold face. Downstairs, Annie continued writing, unaware that at that very moment the real game had begun. Veronica sat at the dining table, her back straight, wearing a white shirt the Seattle Times spread wide open in front of her. On the front page, Ethan's photo appeared in a gray suit, a confident smile, the bold headline reading, "Walker Properties Surges. CEO Ethan Walker invited to keynote at Washington State Economic Conference." A corner of Veronica's lips curved up. She put the newspaper down lightly, touching her finger to the photograph. "Excellent, Ethan. Finally you're back where you belong. And everything is exactly where I want it." Footsteps echoed from the staircase. Annie carried a breakfast tray, the smell of baked goods and fresh milk wafting through the kitchen. She softly greeted, "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes." Veronica didn't look up, only quietly responded, "I'll mix the milk myself today. You go mop the floors." Annie paused slightly, putting the tray down on the table. "Yes, ma'am." She turned her back, heading toward the hallway, but before disappearing, her eyes quickly glanced through the crack in the door. Veronica opened a high cupboard, taking down a small glass jar with a scraped-off label. She gently shook it, listening to the liquid inside slosh, then tilted the jar, dripping a few clear drops into the baby bottle. Each drop fell, dissolving quickly without a trace. Annie swallowed hard. Her hand gripped the mop handle until her knuckles turned white. Her heart pounded, echoing in her throat. She took a deep breath, pretending to turn away as if she hadn't seen anything, but in her mind she began connecting the pieces of suspicion, the children sleeping too long, the smell of the milk every morning, and Veronica's expression whenever anyone touched the mixing bottle. Ethan came down from upstairs, phone in hand, his voice urgent. "I have to rush to the office. There's an issue with the Lakeside project." Veronica put the milk down, her smile bright as sunshine. "You go ahead. I've got everything handled here at home." "Come home early, darling," she added, her voice so soft it was almost pleading. Ethan nodded, kissing her forehead before leaving. When the sound of the door closing echoed, the smile on Veronica's face slowly disappeared. She turned around, her eyes changing completely cold, sharp, and calculating. At noon, sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting long streaks of light onto the floor. The two babies had been given their milk and placed in their cribs. Annie was tidying the living room, but Sophie's wheezing sound made her stop. She moved closer. The little one lay still, her face flushed red, breathing heavily. She gently nudged her Sophie. "Sweetie." No response. Lila, lying next to her, was also deeply asleep, her lips pale, her eyelids twitching slightly. Annie panicked, lifting Sophie out of the crib and rushing toward the living room. Mrs. Hayes. Mrs. Hayes. Veronica appeared at the door, still in her neat dress, her face eerily composed. "What is it?" "The babies. They won't wake up. I keep shaking them." Annie spoke quickly, nervously. Veronica calmly walked over, her voice light, as if discussing lunch. "They're just sleeping. You're too stressed. But their breathing is strange. Look. Give her to me." Veronica reached out, taking the baby. She held Sophie close, gently, soothing her, humming softly. The melody was strange, slow drawn out, unclear whether it was a lullaby or a whisper. The room felt suddenly cold. Annie stepped back, watching the scene, afraid to breathe. That humming gave her the creeps, as if something dark was hidden beneath every note. "See," Veronica said, her eyes still on the child. "They just need more sleep." Annie nodded softly, but her heart was still racing. As Veronica turned away, she noticed a faint smudge of what looked like white powder near the woman's collar, stuck to the edge of her dress. Night fell. The wind blew fiercely, rattling the window frame. Annie lay in her room, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. She tried to tell herself she was just overthinking things. But then footsteps echoed on the wooden floor, slow, steady, as if someone was pacing the hallway. She sat up, grabbed her flashlight, and quietly stepped out. The weak beam lit the hallway, casting light down the stairs. Downstairs, a small strip of yellow light shone from the kitchen. Annie walked down, her heart pounding. She opened the kitchen door, and the cold air rushed out. Veronica wasn't there. Everything was tidy, but one cupboard door was slightly ajar. She pulled it open. In the corner of the cabinet, amidst the spice jars, was a small bottle, labelless cloudy glass with a little clear liquid left inside. She opened the cap, a pungent smell similar to the sedatives at the hospital where she once worked. She took a sharp breath, her hands shaking. Then she quickly shoved the bottle into her coat pocket. Footsteps echoed from behind. Annie froze. "What are you sneaking around for, Annie?" The voice sounded right behind her, slow and clear. She turned around. Veronica stood there, a white robe reaching her ankles. Her hair slightly disheveled, her face half lit, half shadowed by the kitchen light. Mrs. Hayes, are you awake? I just came down for water." Veronica walked closer, one step at a time. A strong, cold perfume enveloped the air. Insomnia. Annie nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, I have trouble sleeping." Veronica smiled, stopping right in front of her, bending slightly, her hand touching Annie's shoulder. "That's fine," she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight that made the listener want to back away. "Just make sure you don't accidentally drink something you shouldn't." The statement landed soft as silk, yet cold as steel. Veronica walked away, her tall figure casting a long shadow on the wooden floor. Her room door closed gently, almost soundlessly. Annie stood there for a long time, the faint yellow kitchen light illuminating her pale face. She pulled her hand out of her pocket, looking at the bottle in her palm, small, frigid, but carrying an unexplainable weight. She took a deep breath, her heart hammering, then quietly whispered to herself, "I need to know what this is." The light flickered off. The kitchen plunged into darkness. Annie stood still, only hearing the sound of the wind outside. Her hand still gripped the bottle, trembling. The next morning, the air was fresh but somber. Seattle was covered in a thin mist, moisture rising from the surface of Lake Union like a cold layer of smoke. Weak sunlight filtered through the tree canopy, shining into the small window where Annie was huddled, her eyes fixed on the glass bottle in her hand. She hadn't slept all night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Veronica's face in the yellow light, her low voice like a blade grazing her neck. Annie held the bottle tightly, the cold sensation running down her spine. She decided she had to know the truth. Quickly putting on her coat, she hid the bottle in her pocket, leaving the house before the sun had fully risen. The cold morning air helped her think clearly. The pharmacy near Lake Union had just opened, the light inside, casting a faint yellow glow. The elderly pharmacist looked up when he saw her enter, his voice hoarse. "Can I help you, Annie?" Placed the bottle on the counter, her voice small but firm. "Can you tell me what this is? I found it at my employer's house." The man put on his glasses, tilted the bottle under the light, and frowned. "Diazepam," he said slowly. "A powerful sedative. Never to be used on infants and even in adults. Excessive use can cause respiratory depression." Annie's chest tightened. She swallowed hard. So if a child took a small dose daily, what would happen? They would gradually weaken, sleep a lot, and have slower reflexes. Their bodies wouldn't develop properly. He paused, his eyes serious. "Where did you find this?" Annie gripped her coat pocket tightly. "Somewhere I can't tell. At least not yet." The pharmacist watched her rush out the door, muttering softly, "That girl is walking into danger." When Annie returned to the mansion, the sun had risen above the lake, casting a golden light across the hallway. In the living room, Ethan was adjusting his tie, ready for his first keynote speech in years. "Mr. Walker," Annie called out, nearly running. I need to talk to you. It's very important." Ethan turned around surprised. "What is it?" But before she could speak, Veronica appeared from the kitchen. A dark blue dress, hugging her body, her smile bright as the sun. "Ethan, let me take care of Annie." "She seems tired. Maybe she's not used to the schedule here." "No," Annie tried to speak, but Ethan held up a hand, his eyes glued to his watch. "I'm late, Annie. Let's talk later." She could only watch him quickly walk out the door, the black car pulling away from the gate, leaving a slight smoke trail in the air. Veronica stood behind her holding a teacup, her eyes fixed on Annie. "You look worried. Have some tea, it might help." Annie stepped back, shaking her head. "Thank you, I'm not thirsty." "Not thirsty." Veronica smiled slightly, placing the teacup on the table. "Fine. Then get to work. I don't like anyone in this house being idle." Throughout that day, the mansion felt suffocated by a thick atmosphere. Annie worked like a phantom, mopping, doing laundry, watching the babies. But every time she intended to go near the children, Veronica was there, standing on the stairs or sitting in the corner of the kitchen, her eyes watching like a quiet jailer. The two babies were sleeping more these days, eating less. Every time Annie saw Veronica mixing the milk, she felt like something was happening that she couldn't control. Late afternoon, Veronica said she was going out to buy dinner. As the door closed, Annie immediately reached for her phone. She called the pharmacist. "It's me, Annie. Can you send me a report on that bottle of medicine? I need proof to protect the children." "Yes, I'll email it right away, but you need to be careful, that type of medicine." The door slammed open, cutting the call short. Annie jumped, nearly dropping her phone. Veronica walked in the afternoon sun, hitting her face, half light, half shadow. "Who are you calling, Annie?" Annie tried to stay calm, quickly putting the phone in her pocket. "Just a friend." Veronica didn't reply. She approached slowly, her steps steady. When she was just an arm's length away, she quickly snatched the phone, looking at the screen. The sent message was still visible. "Report on diazepam, sent to Annie Miller." Her eyes flashed with fury. Without saying anything, Veronica threw the phone to the floor, stomping on it with her heel. A brittle shattering sound echoed. Glass shards scattered, reflecting the light like tiny blades. Annie backed away, her chest tight with fear. Veronica leaned down, her voice low, each word sounding like a hiss. "Listen carefully. Never try to scare him. Don't interfere in what you don't understand. If you hurt my happiness." She looked up, her face so close, Annie could clearly see the thin blue veins in her neck. "I will make you disappear before anyone even remembers your name." After speaking, Veronica stood up straight, adjusted her collar as if nothing had happened, then turned and left. The door slammed shut, leaving a heavy echo. Annie knelt down, picking up the shattered phone. Her finger traced the broken glass, blood oozing out. She clenched her hand, her breathing ragged, tears falling onto the gleaming wooden floor. A drop of blood fell, spreading red on the floor. She looked at it, a tiny red spot in the cold light, then quietly whispered, "No, I won't give up." Outside, the sun set over Lake Union. Inside the house, Veronica stood by the second-floor window, looking down at the yard. The wind gently moved the curtains, the last rays of light shining on the faint smile on her lips. The Seattle night was quiet, thick clouds covering almost the entire moon. Streetlights reflected on the puddles outside the Walker mansion gate. The black car slid into the drive, the engine slowly silencing, leaving only the faint hum of cooling metal. Ethan stepped out, adjusting his tie. The keynote speech had been a resounding success, praised by the press, but instead of pride, he felt an inexplicable heavy sense, a vague premonition that something wasn't right at home. He walked in, the sound of the door closing echoing dryly. The house was unusually dark, with only a small light on in the kitchen. He called out, "Veronica, Annie." No answer, only the ticking of the clock and the whistling of the wind through the door cracks. As he walked into the middle of the kitchen, something made him stop. On the gleaming wooden floor, there was a small spot of blood dried dark, spread into a distorted drop shape. He bent down lightly, touching it with his fingertip. Real blood. A cold wave ran down his spine. He called out louder, "Annie, where are you?" A faint sound came from the storage room next to the kitchen. He opened the door, and the dim light illuminated the small room. Annie sat on the floor, her hand roughly wrapped in tissues, blood seeping through. Next to her was the shattered phone glass shards scattered everywhere. Ethan rushed over. "My God, what happened?" Annie quickly hid her hand, looking down. "Nothing, sir. I dropped a glass, cut my hand a little." Ethan looked around. No glass, only phone fragments and a few scratches on the floor. He frowned, but before he could ask further, Veronica's voice came from behind, soft and smooth as silk. "Darling, don't worry. She dropped the baby's bottles, and then she blamed me for scolding her." Ethan turned around. Veronica stood at the doorway, her hair softly down the light, casting her face in a way that made her look like an innocent angel, but her eyes sharp as needles. What did you say?" Ethan asked slowly. "She was clumsy. She broke the bottles. I scolded her a little. Then she cried, slipped and knocked over her phone, shattering the glass." Ethan looked up at Annie. She looked down, her voice soft as wind. "No, that's not true, sir. I didn't say she." "Are you daring to argue?" Veronica took another step, her voice losing its softness. "I told you from the start, in this house everyone must maintain order." Ethan raised a hand to intervene. "Enough, Veronica. Don't raise your voice." The air froze. Annie looked at him, her eyes tearful, showing a mixture of fear and despair. I just wanted to talk to Mr. Walker about the babies." Veronica was quicker, cutting her off with a casually smooth tone. "You know, she even secretly made a call this afternoon. I didn't want to mention it, but it looked like it was to a pharmacy." Ethan spun around to Annie. "Is that true?" Annie took a deep breath, trembling. "Yes. I only asked about a certain medicine. I found it in the house, so what are you talking about?" Ethan narrowed his eyes, his voice skeptical. Veronica sighed, placing a hand on his shoulder, her voice like soothing a child. "See, she's getting paranoid. She said I was trying to poison your children. She even called a pharmacy to check up on me." Ethan withdrew his hand, looking at Annie. In his eyes there was pity mixed with exhaustion. He was too drained for arguments. "Annie, I don't want any more trouble. Go rest. We'll talk tomorrow." Annie opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. She only looked at him then, at Veronica, who wore a subtle smile, the smile of a victor. Ethan left the room, his shadow disappearing up the stairs. The sound of his footsteps gradually faded. Only the two women remained. Veronica stood still for a few seconds, listening to the clock ticking in the empty kitchen. Then she turned back to Annie, her lips slowly curving. "Don't worry. I'll make sure you rest permanently." She opened a drawer near the sink, pulling out a set of keys. Her eyes stopped at the smallest key with a faint label, basement. She twirled it between her fingers, a thin smile appearing. Outside, thunder rumbled. Lightning flashed through the window, reflecting in Veronica's eyes two cold, metal-like glints. She walked away, her shoes clicking steadily on the wooden floor, fading into the hallway darkness. Annie remained sitting motionless, clutching her wound. Blood seeped through the tissue bandage, dripping onto the floor where the old blood drop was still not quite dry. A strong gust of wind from the lake blew in, gently swaying the curtains. And in that moment, amidst the cold seeping through the door, Annie distinctly felt one thing: someone in this house was about to vanish. Rain hammered on the roof tiles, the wind howling through the door cracks, creating bone-chilling sounds. In her small room upstairs, Annie lay on her side, eyes closed but mind awake. Her hand was still bandaged, throbbing faintly. Every time she tried to nap, the image of Veronica with the basement key reappeared, her smile blurred in the lightning flash. She opened her eyes, breathing heavily. Then, amidst the silence, a small sound. Click. The hallway door quietly opened. Bare feet softly touched the wooden floor, slow, rhythmic moving toward the nursery. Annie held her breath. She sat up, straining to listen. A cold draft of wind from the door crack swept in, gently moving the curtain. Under the door, a yellow light shone from the nursery, strange because she was certain she had turned off the light after putting the babies to sleep. Her heart pounded. She tiptoed out. With every step, the wooden floor creaked faintly, betraying her. As she got closer, she heard a very slight clink, the sound of a bottle cap twisting. Annie pushed the door open. In the dim light, Veronica stood by the baby's crib, her shadow stretching long on the wall. In her hand was the small medicine bottle cap, open, the clear liquid sloshing at the bottom. "What is she doing?" Annie whispered, then didn't stop to think. She lunged forward, the sound of a chair crashing. A sharp collision echoed throughout the room. The bottle fell, shattering, the liquid spreading across the floor. Veronica screamed, her voice sharp as a knife. "Are you crazy?" The two children woke up startled, Lila bursting into hysterical cries, her sobs filling the thick air. Sophie woke up too, wailing alongside her sister. Annie held the two babies, trembling as she backed away. "What were you going to give them? Tell me." "Shut up." Veronica lunged, grasping for the shattered bottle, a piece of glass cutting her hand. Blood dripped onto the floor, spreading red in the light. The crying echoed throughout the floor. And in the room next door, Ethan bolted upright. He ran down the hallway, flipping the light switch. White light flooded the floor, clearly showing the chaotic scene. Veronica sat on the floor, her hand bleeding, her hair messy, her face streaked with tears. Annie knelt nearby, hugging the two children tightly, trembling. "What is going on?" Ethan nearly shouted. Veronica pointed, her voice distraught. "She's insane." "She rushed into the room while I was trying to comfort the babies." Annie gasped, tears flowing. "No, she was going to give them medicine. I saw it with my own eyes." Ethan glanced at the floor-shattered glass, spilled colorless liquid, the two children still sobbing hysterically. "Ethan." Veronica choked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Do you believe me or her? I was just trying to get your children to sleep. I love them like my own, you know that." "And you?" He turned to Annie, his voice tight as a wire. "Do you have any proof? That bottle right there?" Annie pointed, but Veronica was quicker, subtly using her foot to nudge the last piece of glass with the label still intact under the rug. The action was so smooth it was almost invisible. "There's nothing there," Veronica said, her voice sounding like a sob. "See? She's making things up." Ethan bent down, only seeing anonymous fragments and a few drops of colorless liquid. He picked it up, the label completely peeled off. Anger, exhaustion, and confusion intertwined. He gripped the glass fragment. "I don't want to argue anymore. Both of you get out of here right now. Let me calm the children down." Annie slowly stepped forward, trying to touch his arm. "Please, sir, please have their blood tested. If I'm wrong, I will leave forever." Veronica cut her off with a faint smile, just enough for Annie to see. "You talk too much." Ethan turned his back, holding the two little ones, trying to soothe them. He no longer knew who to trust. Behind him, the two women stood facing each other, one trembling, the other cold as ice. Blood from Veronica's hand dripped onto the white floor, each drop landing right on the old spot where Annie had left her first drop of blood. She looked down at the floor, a flash of coldness in her eyes, then bent down gently, using her foot to push all the shattered glass under the white rug. When Ethan looked up, Veronica had wrapped her hand with a scarf, her face softening, her voice. "Quiet, I was just worried about the kids." Annie stood still, watching her, knowing for certain that the truth was being buried right in front of him, along with the only evidence that could save the two children. Outside, thunder roared, lightning flashed, and the wind whipped the curtains. A beam of light cut through the air, shining directly onto Veronica's face, illuminating her for a moment, beautiful, serene, and terrifyingly cold. In the courtyard of St. Mary's Hospital, Ethan's car screeched to a halt outside the emergency entrance. The door flew open and he rushed out tightly, holding the two little girls, Lila and Sophie, their small bodies burning hot, heads slumped against his chest, their breathing ragged. "Help me. Somebody please help." His voice, hoarse and strained, shattered the quiet morning air. A nurse immediately wheeled a gurney over. A team of doctors rushed out from the on-call room. Annie followed, her face pale, her hand still bandaged with dried blood. She clutched her chest, her heart pounding so violently it was almost painful. The two babies were rushed into the emergency room. The door closed, the staff-only sign swinging in the cold wind. Ethan stood there, trembling all over his shirt, damp with rain and sweat. Everything was spinning around him, the sound of machines' footsteps, the distant cries of children. He wondered what he had done to let things get this far. A moment later, Dr. Collins, a man in his 50s with round glasses, walked out. His face was grave. Mr. Walker Ethan stepped forward, his voice choked. "My children, how are they?" Dr. Collins opened a file. "We ran blood tests. The results show that the amount of diazepam, a sedative in the baby's blood, is multiple times higher than the acceptable limit." The space seemed to freeze. Ethan looked up, his eyes glazed over. "What did you say, diazepam?" The doctor emphasized a sedative used for adults with anxiety or insomnia. "This dosage can cause central nervous system depression in young children." Ethan gasped, his hands tightly gripping the chair rail. The image of the shattered bottle, Annie's desperate cries last night, and Veronica's tear-filled eyes all overlapped in his mind. "Doctor," Collins continued, "the babies have been given fluids and detoxification treatment. Fortunately, they were discovered in time. But you should prepare yourself. They will have to stay for observation for a few days. And," he looked straight into Ethan's eyes, "we are obligated to notify the authorities, as this may constitute intentional endangerment of minors." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. The room door burst open, and Veronica walked in. Her face was ashen, her hair messy, her eyes tear-filled. "Oh my God!" she screamed, running to the bedside where Lila lay deeply asleep. "What happened to my children? Ethan, tell me. Why are they like this?" Ethan didn't reply. He just looked at her, his gaze cold and deep, devoid of any remaining trust. "Aren't you going to say anything?" Veronica tried to grab his hand, but he pulled away. Dr. Collins observed the scene, then spoke up. "Mrs. Hayes, you may need to stay and cooperate with the investigation. The test results have confirmed the presence of diazepam in the baby's blood." Veronica froze. "Are you accusing me?" "No one is accusing you," the doctor said softly. "We are just following procedure." She turned to Ethan, her voice trembling. "Don't you trust me? I'm their mother." Ethan closed his eyes, his voice low. "I only trust the results." A long silence. Only the steady beeping of the heart monitor could be heard. About 20 minutes later, as the police were being called, Annie walked in with a middle-aged man, the pharmacist she had met. He looked tired, his coat damp from the rain, but his eyes were resolute. "Mr. Walker." Annie approached, her voice still shaky but clear. "This is Mr. Hensley, the pharmacist from Union Pharmacy. He has evidence regarding the medicine bottle Mrs. Veronica used." Veronica backed away, her eyes darting quickly. "She's making things up. Ethan, don't listen to her." The pharmacist opened his briefcase, taking out a paper with a red stamp. "This is the report confirming the batch of diazepam sold 2 months ago. The batch number matches the bottle casing Miss Annie found. And the buyer's name," he looked at Ethan, "is Veronica Hayes." The room seemed to hold its breath. Ethan looked at Veronica. She took another step back, her lips trembling. "No, that's impossible. I only bought it for myself. I have insomnia, you know that." "Then why was the bottle in the nursery?" Ethan asked, his voice echoing against the walls. "She framed me," Veronica shrieked, pointing at Annie. "She wants to separate us, steal you. She always looked at you with those eyes. Are you blind not to see it?" Annie shook her head, tears falling. "I only wanted to protect the children," Dr. Collins interjected, his voice stern. "Mrs. Hayes, that's enough. The police are on their way. We are obliged to keep you here for questioning." Veronica stood motionless. Her face changed quickly from panic to emptiness. Her eyes looked around, then stopped at her own hand. Her wedding ring sparkled in the hospital light. She twisted it, as if calculating an escape. The door burst open. Ruth walked in, out of breath. She wore an old coat, her hair soaked. "I just flew back from Portland. I knew something was wrong." Ethan looked at her, his voice tight. "Ruth," she walked up, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I didn't have a chance to tell you before I left. I left the camera system on in the backyard. It's still working. I think now is the time to watch it." Ethan looked straight into her eyes, then nodded. "Turn it on." Ruth pulled out her phone, opening the video. The screen showed a blurry image filmed by the infrared camera in the corner of the backyard. They saw Veronica sitting next to the metallic basin pouring medicine into the baby bottles and stirring. The air in the hospital room thickened. The hiss of the air conditioner blended with the pounding hearts in everyone's chests. Veronica stumbled backward, hitting the wall. No, that wasn't me. That's a fabrication. She made quiet. Ethan cut her off, his voice cracking with rage. How blind was I? I let you live in my house, touch my children, kiss their foreheads every night. He clenched his fist, but tears welled up. Clara would never forgive me. Veronica burst into tears, kneeling on the floor. But in those wet eyes there was no longer pain, only calculation slowly fading away. She spoke softly, almost a whisper. You don't understand. Without me you would be nothing. Dr. Collins signaled to a nurse. Outside the hallway, the steady sound of police footsteps echoed, drawing closer. 2 officers walked in. The red and blue lights of the police car flashed through the window, reflecting on the hospital wall. One of them said, Veronica Hayes, you are under arrest on suspicion of intentional endangerment of minors. They approached and restrained her. Veronica didn't resist, only looked up at Ethan, a faint smile on her lips, a smile that sent shivers down his spine. As they led her down the hallway, the flashing lights cast her shadow long and thin on the wall before it vanished around the corner. The door closed. Ethan stood still for a long time. Annie walked over, gently placing a hand on his arm. The babies will be fine, sir. I believe that. He turned around, looking at her for a long time, his eyes tired but sincere. Thank you. If it weren't for you, I would have lost everything. 2 weeks flew by. Seattle was in late spring, cool breezes from Lake Union, carrying the scent of lilacs and damp earth. News reports briefly stated Veronica Hayes, suspect in juvenile endangerment case, detained pending trial. Ethan folded the newspaper, not reading further. He didn't need any more details. Once was more than enough. He only attended court for one morning to see the woman he once believed could help him start over. Veronica appeared in a gray jumpsuit, her hair messy, her eyes vacant. As she was led away, they passed each other without a word. There was nothing left to say. That afternoon, Ethan returned to the mansion where everything began. The house looked completely different, no more dim lights or the cold atmosphere of previous days. Windows where sparkling clean curtains replaced the front steps bathed in sunlight. But inside him, there was still a strange emptiness, as if he were stepping through his own ashes. From a distance, the clear laughter of the 2 little girls echoed. Lila and Sophie were playing in the garden, Annie sitting nearby, her shirt sleeves rolled up, her hair neatly tied back. Sunlight glistened on the water in the basin, the old metallic basin Ethan had wanted to discard, now cleaned by Annie and used for watering the plants. He stood there for a moment, watching the scene. Something in his heart was released, relief mixed with sadness. Then he walked down, carrying the same basin, now shiny after being scrubbed. I think it should be used properly, he said, placing the basin on the grass. Annie looked up, her eyes surprised yet gentle. I thought you wanted to throw it away. Ethan smiled faintly. I did. But it can still be repurposed if you know how to clean it. He looked down at the 2 babies giggling in the sun, then turned to her. The first time I saw you, you were protecting them. And I was blind. Annie bent down, touching the water surface in the basin. Sunlight reflected brightly on her hand. The past can still be cleansed if we're willing to wash it, she said softly, her voice like the wind. Ethan looked at her silently for a long time. His eyes lingered on the small scar on her hand, where blood had once oozed in the dark night when she hid the bottle. He remembered every detail, every drop of blood, every sob of the 2 children. All of it was behind them, but it was also what saved the father and his 2 daughters from the abyss. He spoke in a deep, warm voice. Annie, thank you. Not just for saving my children, but for saving me from my own blindness. She bowed her head, a slow smile spreading. You don't owe me anything. I was just doing what any decent person should do. In the afternoon, Ruth returned. She walked through the gate, her eyes tearing up when she saw the 2 babies run to greet her. Ethan hugged her, the first genuine smile since all the tragedy. The house was once again filled with voices, the smell of hot food, and the bright laughter of children. That evening after dinner, Ruth took the babies upstairs and Ethan stepped out onto the porch. A gentle breeze blew through carrying the scent of rain-soaked grass. Annie was standing by the window wiping away the last bit of dust on the glass. The moonlight shone on her face, kind calm, but still bearing traces of sleepless nights. Ethan walked closer, his voice low and soft. "You know, since you came, this house finally has a soul. Before that, it was just an empty shell." Annie stopped wiping, turning back. "I only did small things. The children are the reason this house lights up." Ethan looked deep into her eyes, then spoke softly but firmly. "Light doesn't come on its own, Annie. It comes from the person who brings it in." Annie looked down, smiling, her eyes glistening in the light. She didn't say anything more, only gently placed her hand on his. In that moment, everything was still the past, the trauma, the mistakes all washed clean, like the water surface in the basin reflecting the moonlight. The next morning, the sky was clear. Sunlight covered the garden. Annie placed the metallic basin in the middle of the yard, filling it with warm water. The two babies giggled, clapping their hands on the water surface, creating small ripples. Ethan sat beside them, stirring the water gently. "I used to hate this sound," he said, "but now it makes me feel peaceful." Annie looked at him smiling. "Because now you know the water won't hurt anyone anymore. It's cleansing." He nodded. They watched the two children play with the water droplets sparkling under the sun. The light reflected on the basin onto their faces, warm, bright, and alive. In the corner of the garden, Ruth watched the scene, sighing contentedly. She turned away, smiling, knowing that this house, once filled with bad intentions, had found its soul again. Late afternoon, as the sun set, Annie put away the toys and Ethan rearranged the chairs on the porch. The two babies were asleep, their breathing steady. The light in the nursery shone out soft and warm yellow. Ethan poured 2 cups of tea, handing one to Annie. "I still don't know how to repay you," he said. "Don't repay me," she replied. "Just keep this house bright so the 2 little ones can grow up in peace." Ethan looked at her, his eyes lingering for a long time. Then he spoke softly. "The light doesn't just happen, Annie. It comes from the person who carries it." Annie looked down, smiling, her eyes sparkling in the light. She didn't say anything more, only gently placed her hand on his. In that moment, everything was quiet, the past, the pain, the missteps, all washed clean like the water surface in the basin glittering in the moonlight. Night fell, and the wind rustled through the trees. In the garden, the metallic basin reflected the star-filled sky. The two babies slept soundly in their room, and on the porch, Ethan and Annie sat next to each other, no further words needed. The children's laughter from the afternoon seemed to linger somewhere, blending with the steady sound of dripping water. Moonlight fell onto the silver basin, illuminating 3 figures, a man, a woman, and 2 children, a true family. And that concludes tonight's bedtime story. A journey closes from the darkness of doubt, fear, and bad intentions to the light of truth, trust, and affection. A home of light is not just a place where Ethan and his 2 daughters found peace again, but also proof that sometimes light doesn't come from magic. It comes from people brave enough to do the right thing even when facing serious risk. So what about you? After hearing this story, which character resonated with you the most? Ethan, the father who was once blind but learned to re-embrace life? Annie, the courageous young woman who stood up against wrongdoing? Or Ruth, the quiet keeper of the home's warmth? And throughout the story, which action moved you the most? Was it the moment Annie held the 2 babies in the rainy night, or when Ethan knelt beside the metallic basin, a symbol of atonement and a new beginning? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know, how did you feel about this journey from shadow to illumination? Let's share, discuss, and continue with more heartwarming, insightful stories in the nights to come.